Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first installment of Primary Source's three-part webinar series, Politics and Cultures in the Middle East Today. My name's Dan Osborne, and I'm a program director here at Primary Source. It's my pleasure to be joined by all of you tonight as we embark on this exploration of the modern Middle East, expanding our knowledge and considering a range of topics that can be brought into classrooms to promote students' global understanding and critical thinking. For those of you who may be new to Primary Source, we are a Massachusetts-based nonprofit committed to promoting global learning in K-12 classrooms. We work with teachers to foster students' knowledge, skills, and dispositions for responsible and engaged citizenship through professional development and curricular resources. We use multicultural and culturally responsive approaches to nurture civic mindedness among students in an increasingly diverse and interconnected world. To learn more about our work and our upcoming online course offerings, visit www.primarysource.org. Among our other resources, you'll be able to access our archive of past webinars on a range of topics that can be of service in bringing the world into your classroom. Feel free to recommend tonight's or other webinar recordings to teachers and colleagues. Each year, we offer a webinar series exploring historical and contemporary global topics in depth. For this series, we're focusing on politics and culture in the Middle East today. In our upcoming installments, we will study ethnic and religious minorities in the region, along with examples of youth culture and expression. Collectively, we hope that this series will offer a marketplace of narratives and perspectives on the Middle East, illuminating the plurality and diversity of identities and experiences in this vibrant and relevant part of the world. Today's webinar focuses on regional politics, in particular the rivalries and power dynamics unfolding today and manifesting themselves in Syria, Yemen, and beyond. We're joined by Peter Krause, Associate Professor of Political Science at Boston College. Professor Krause's expertise is in international politics, and his research focuses on international security, Middle East politics, and national movements. He's the author of Rebel Power: Why National Movements Compete, Fight, and Win, published by Cornell University Press. His articles and other published work focus on social movements, the US intervention in the Syrian Civil War, the war of ideas in the Middle East, and political divisions within the Palestinian national movement. Before we transition to Professor Krause, I'd like to invite and encourage everybody to type questions in the chat box. I'll be monitoring this and bringing them to Professor Krause's attention throughout the presentation. For participants in this series interested in earning professional development points, I'd like to remind you that you're eligible to earn a total of 10 PDPs for joining us in each of these three installments in the series. If you're unable to view one of the live webinars, please remember that the recordings will be available both on our website and on our YouTube page. In order to earn PDPs, we ask that you respond to the reflection prompts that will be sent out via email after each webinar within 2 weeks of the initial live stream. As we listen to Professor Krause, let's keep in mind the following questions. Again, you'll receive these in written form following tonight's live webinar. Considering today's topic, think about the following. How does Professor Krause's framework of a new Middle East Cold War connect to, extend, and challenge your understanding of the underpinnings to regional political dynamics in the Middle East today? For those of you working with students in the classroom, how would you introduce this framework to contemporary politics in the Middle East in ways that are scaffolded to promote understanding, analysis, and interpretation? Again, we'll send these questions out via email to you to review and reflect upon in the coming days. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Krause for the presentation we're calling Regional Rivalries and Power Politics in the Middle East, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Dan. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Wonderful. So first, I just want to thank Dan and thank Primary Source. I've been having the pleasure of working with Primary Source for a number of years now. Dan gave me a very kind introduction. The only thing he didn't mention that's of relevance is that I myself was a high school teacher for a couple of years after I graduated college. I taught US history, I taught world history, and one of the reasons I love interacting with Primary Source and many of you on the webinar who are yourselves teachers is because I myself has been in the classroom trying to teach, hundreds or thousands of years of history, knowing some parts of it better than others. And, I teach, of course, now at Boston College, but I think in many ways I have it easier because I'm able to focus in great depth on shorter time periods, more particular countries. And so I really welcome these opportunities to kind of hopefully get you up to speed on a region or on topics that you probably have to teach about in your own classrooms, but maybe don't have the time that I do to be able to focus on this stuff. So I'm going to talk to you guys for about the next 55 minutes or so and leave some time, about 15 or 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. But as Dan mentioned, I welcome questions throughout the talk. So there are chat boxes there. You're welcome to type questions as we go. Dan and I should be able to see them. And to the extent that I can, I will integrate my answers to them into the presentation. And then, of course, if you have other questions or in-depth ones, you're welcome to think about those or write those down. And we'll have some time for back and forth at the end of the talk. In any case, thank you guys again for attending. I know it's obviously a very difficult time health-wise and society-wise. I'll just mention that this is not, of course, limited to the United States. The Middle East is facing a great deal of challenges regarding the coronavirus. Just to give you an example, I was reading the news today. Jordan has imposed martial law within its country and had a 2-week or so kind of shutdown. Israel just today passed a law making it so no citizens are allowed to enter the country at all. Iran, as maybe you have followed, has thousands of cases and is one of the biggest hotspots in the world, in part because some of the outbreaks of the coronavirus in Iran have been in cities like Qom that are major places for pilgrimage and religious worship. So in any case, all these issues that unfortunately we're seeing going on around us are also going on in the Middle East as well. So even though the majority of my talk today will not focus on that stuff, I'll say a little bit about it. The region and the people that we're talking about today are facing some of the same challenges that we are. So just something to keep in mind. All right, so let's start by talking a little about the Middle East. And to talk about the Middle East, one of the things I want to do is I want to start with a letter to the editor that was written about 5 or 6 years ago and describes relations in the region. But honestly, even though it's been a few years since then, a lot of it is still somewhat relevant. So read this along with me here. Sir, Iran is backing Assad. Gulf states are against Assad. If you don't know who Assad is, Bashar al-Assad is the president of Syria. Okay? Assad is against Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood and Obama are against General Sisi, then President Obama. Okay? General Sisi, if you don't know, is the president of Egypt. But Gulf states are pro-Sisi, which means they are against Muslim Brotherhood. Iran is pro-Hamas, but Hamas is backing Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas, if you don't know, is a militant and political organization, a Palestinian organization based largely in Gaza, but also other parts of the region. Okay, Obama is backing Muslim Brotherhood, yet Hamas is against the US. You guys have it so far? Gulf states are pro-US, but Turkey is with Gulf states against Assad, yet Turkey is pro-Muslim Brotherhood against General Sisi, and General Sisi is being backed by the Gulf states. Welcome to the Middle East and have a nice day. Now, you might read this and say, oh my gosh, this is so complex. Like, I don't even know who a number of these actors are, let alone I can't keep track of all the relations between them. But this writer, Mr. Sabah, or Mr. Sabah, unclear from the KN, is correct in the sense of these are all the relations here. Someone actually tried to diagram this op-ed and it looked like this. So one of the first things I want to say is when you look at the Middle East and you look at international relations in the Middle East, this is what you see here. You're not alone. In fact, I've studied the Middle East now for about 15 years. I've spent a number of years living in a variety of countries in the Middle East, interviewing people, working in the archives. And I'll be honest, sometimes when I look at Middle East politics, I still see something like this. If you note in the bottom right-hand corner, it says, note, Palestine and Israel were discounted for the sake of simplicity. So this is how the Middle East sometimes looks in terms of friend and foe and uncertain, if we don't include the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is quite complex by itself, and one that I'll talk about in the latter part of this talk. But what I'm going to try to do tonight is to untangle this web for you and make it so, obviously we can't in an hour make you full experts on the Middle East, but what we can do is give you a number of frames that you can use as a basis to then go in and start to understand what exactly are the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. What's going on in the Syrian Civil War? What's the situation on the Israeli-Palestinian peace deal? Why is the United States involved in the Middle East at all, and what are debates over its foreign policy there? These are the types of questions that I think are important for us as citizens, but also as teachers, as students, etc., to understand. And what I'm going to try to do tonight, in addition to giving you a lot of this knowledge, is to weigh in on a number of ways I think you can utilize this information in your classroom to teach your own students and give them this foundation, regardless of age, middle school, high school, college. A lot of this stuff is stuff I use in my own class, but I think your students can access it and use it as well. Okay, so just going in terms of a little background for Syria, because the Syrian Civil War for us in many ways is going to be the linchpin for a lot of the lessons we're going to have tonight. I just want to give you a very brief historical background to where Syria came from in the first place. Now, the first thing to understand is that if you talk to Syrians, and I've been lucky enough to be in Syria, I was living a bit in Syria in 2010, just randomly right before a lot of the uprising happened, they'll say, look, we are incredibly proud people. Damascus as a city is one of the oldest settled cities in the world. It's been settled for about 10,000 years. Americans, you guys have only been around for a couple hundred years, and that's true. At the same time, however, the actual nation state, the country of Syria, has only been around for about 100 years or so, and even less if you count in terms of its independence. So what you're seeing here on the slide is a map of the Middle East, and particularly a map looking at Syria. The important thing to understand is that before World War I, before the 19 teens, Syria and the surrounding region was controlled largely by the Ottoman Empire. This empire that, the vestiges of it are now kind of what's in modern day Turkey, but the Ottoman Empire threw in its lot with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians in World War I. They lost. And one of the reasons that they lost is that they were facing a revolt from within their own borders. So a number of Arabs, led by this guy, Faisal ibn Hussein, who came from the Hijaz, which is basically in western Saudi Arabia, led a revolt against the Ottomans in partnerships with the British and the French. The idea being that if they fought together against the Ottomans in the aftermath of the war, they would divide the spoils of the Middle East. And what you're seeing in this map is basically how those spoils were divided. The British and the French basically said, okay, we're going to carve up this region among ourselves. Now, we're not going to kind of colonize it fully, but these are going to be mandates under the League of Nations that we're going to control. And so the orange areas were the ones that were controlled by the French. The yellow areas were the ones that were controlled by the British. So the actual borders of Syria that exist to this day were drawn by the French and the British in the aftermath of World War I. So anytime you talk in class about colonialism, or you talk about some of the challenges of the Middle East, about how sometimes national and ethnic borders don't line up with actual territorial borders, you can go back to this period and say, look, the state of Iraq, the state of Transjordan, now called Jordan, those were wholly created entities by the British. Now, people lived there for a long time. If you're teaching, say, a Western civilization or world history class, you might start by teaching about the Tigris and the Euphrates and the development of ancient civilizations in modern-day Iraq, and that's true. But the actual state of Iraq was created by the British with certain borders to serve British interests in the broader empire. So that's the first important thing to understand as a background. Now, let's transition up to closer to present day. The state of Syria gets its independence in the mid-20th century. And from basically the 1970s onwards, it's controlled by the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party is an Arab nationalist party. If you look in the upper left-hand corner here, even if you don't read Arabic, you can see this kind of green outline with actually the flag of the Arab revolt above it. And that's basically the Ba'ath Party symbol. What that green map is showing is basically all countries that have an Arab majority, a majority of the people who are speaking Arabic. And the Ba'ath Party is an Arab nationalist party, led by this guy, the pictured here, named Hafez al-Assad. Now, if Assad sounds like a familiar name, it is. This is Bashar al-Assad's father. So this is the father of the current president of Syria, who ruled all the way from 71 up until 2000 when he died, and then his son took over from him. Now, what's fascinating is that before Hafez al-Assad took power in Syria, there was a series of coups, one after the other, that overthrew the leader of Syria. And yet, since 1971, there has not been a single successful coup in Syria. One of the major reasons for that is Hafez al-Assad basically coup-proofed his regime. And what I mean by that is he basically put individuals who are from his family or from his ethnic groups, the Alawis, in charge of key political and military posts. The idea being that if there was an uprising or there were protests inside the country, those individuals would stay loyal to him, not back out on him, not try to overthrow him, etc. And that's really held served throughout a variety of uprisings in Syria since the 70s. So to come up to the present day, or the present uprising and civil war, it's important to understand that the civil war in Syria today did not start as a civil war. It was not a bunch of people just picking up guns and trying to kill Bashar al-Assad and overthrow him from power. Not at all. Back in March of 2011, you saw things like this on the picture of the slide here, which is you saw a series of nonviolent protests, starting in Dera, which is actually this kind of border town between Jordan and Syria. When I went into Syria, I came there through Dera in Jordan. But what you saw protests against the regime, not initially to overthrow it, but to say, look, we want jobs, we want greater political freedoms, all these types of things. We want reform, basically. And the Assad government and Assad promised reform and said, yes, we're going to make some changes. He shuffled around his cabinet, but at the end of the day, he did not make major political or economic reforms. Instead, he started to potentially beat and brutalize a number of protesters. One of the pictures you see here is a protester who was whipped with electrical cords in the course of a protest. People were disappeared. People are held without trial. And so it starts to basically turn what is a nonviolent, mass-based protest in Syria, which was incredibly impressive. They broke what I say here is the wall of fear, people being afraid of protesting against an authoritarian government. They went out and they protested, but it wasn't that effective. And then what also starts to happen is not only is the Assad government brutalizing protesters, but you get foreign Middle East states who start to back some of the protesters, sometimes with guns, sometimes with money, and because they want Assad to be gone. And so by the fall of 2011, what had been a broad-based nonviolent protest, like you had seen in Tunisia, like you had seen in Egypt at the end of 2010 and early 2011, became a violent civil war by the fall of 2011. All of this, though, is in the context of what you guys have probably heard of before, which is the Arab Spring. So when people use the term Arab Spring, what they're referring to is the fact that there were mass protests and in some cases armed uprisings across many countries in the Middle East. So what this map is showing you is all the various countries in the region and then kind of color coding, this is from The Economist, of what was happening in those countries at that time. So you can see in places like Tunisia and in Egypt, you actually had by July 2011, the governments toppled. Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and Hussein Ali in Tunisia, Ben Ali in Tunisia, were overthrown in the course of nonviolent protest. But then in countries like Syria, like I was just talking about, in Libya and Yemen, you had armed civil war trying to potentially replace the current government. So what you saw, or what people in the region saw on their TV screens, looks something like this. You turn on Al Jazeera, which is the #1 ranked satellite news station in the Middle East, it would look something like this. Pictures like in the bottom right, that's in Bahrain. In the upper left, that's Tahrir Square in Cairo, Egypt. So basically all of these different countries in major capitals, you saw thousands, if not millions of people out on the streets protesting against their governments, protesting against political restraints, against economic unemployment, against all corruption, all of these types of things. And in fact, being able to look and see this on your TV screen really reinforced for others, hey, I'm not out here alone. I have solidarity with other people in the Arab community, the Arab world, or the broader Middle East. And this was an incredibly powerful time that made many people feel like, all right, we might get democratic reforms in the Middle East for the first time. We might have people's voices be heard in ways that they often weren't in the region because many of these countries were not democratic. Instead, they were either monarchies or they were authoritarian countries where there were elections, but they generally were not free and fair. One of the things that you can do with your classes to talk about the Arab Spring and kind of a backdrop to the Middle East today is you can do something like this. And I'm a political scientist, so I'm somewhat like contractually obligated to have a 2x2 chart in my talks or my books or otherwise, but I'm going to show you briefly how to do one and how this can be a very simple but very powerful exercise. Because when you're a political scientist or a social scientist, you're looking at history, you're looking at what happened, but you're also always trying to look for patterns, not just about, why the uprising happened in Syria, but in general, why did uprisings happen across a number of countries? And why did they happen in some countries but not other countries? At the same time, beyond just causes, you also want to look at outcomes. Why in some countries were there protests that led to regime change, and in others, the regime was able to endure and remain in power? That's all we're doing here. You by yourself or with your class can sit here and draw a basic 2x2 chart, and then you can label it this way, right? Significant uprising, no significant uprising on the x-axis. Then on the y-axis, the regime was overthrown, the regime was not overthrown. And then all you can do is, again, by yourself or with your students, is you can say, okay, take every country in the Middle East and place it in one of those 4 boxes, right? Every country is one of those 4 combinations. Either it's a country where there was a significant uprising and the regime was overthrown. That's something like Egypt. Or there was no significant uprising, but the regime was overthrown. That's pretty rare because you're not generally going to have a regime overthrown without any uprising. Bottom left corner, significant uprising, but the regime not overthrown. That's something like Syria, where there's been an uprising, but the regime remains in power. And then no significant uprising, regime not overthrown. That's something like Algeria, where there were not massive protests and the regime still endures. So if you do this, and again, you can use these slides later, this is in some ways one of the answers to it, or one of the things that can come out of it. So you can populate this 2x2 chart, and then you can ask yourself or your students, okay, what do the countries inside each of these boxes have in common? What's similar and what's different? And just by doing that, you can start to generate explanations for why countries have uprisings or don't, because what are the ones have in common on their left side of the chart versus the right side? And then secondly, what makes it more or less likely a government's going to change? You can compare the countries on the top part of the chart versus the bottom, and then even the combinations between them. One of the things you see is in this chart here, which is to say, okay, this is also a 2x2 chart, but breaking it down based on two factors. Number one, are you a major oil exporter or not? And then number two, are you a hereditary regime? So a country like Syria, like I talked about, where Hafez al-Assad is coup-proofing the regime, or basically any monarchy where it's passing from the king to one of his sons who's a prince, those are hereditary regimes, whereas non-hereditary regimes are ones like the United States, where we have elections, and despite the fact that during a certain period it seems like our presidents were going to go Clinton, Bush, in general, we are not a hereditary regime. People take power not based on bloodlines, but based on something else. Okay, what do you see when you look at this chart? Every country that's bolded had a significant uprising. And then every country that's italicized had regime change. So you look at this, again, it's social science. We're not physics. We don't have laws that are 100% correct. But we do have things that happen in general. And one of the things you see by looking at this chart is the following. Look in the upper right-hand corner. That's a pattern. You have three countries, and only three, that are both non-hereditary regimes and don't significantly export oil. And what's fascinating is all three of those had an uprising and the regime was replaced. So if you want to say, okay, what are some of the factors that seem to make it more likely that a regime might have an uprising and that it might be replaced? Well, there are some of them. And let's go through the logic of that. When countries have oil, and this happened with the Saudis, with the Qataris, with the Kuwaitis, with a number of others, they would literally just give money to their citizens amidst this stuff and say, kind of like the United States government today is saying, well, the economy is slowing down with the coronavirus. Maybe we're all going to get a couple $1,000s put into our bank accounts. The Saudis did this amidst the uprising, not amidst the virus, basically saying, here's $10,000 or $20,000. Now be happy and don't protest against us. And to be honest, a lot of that worked. And to be fair, a lot of their people weren't that upset in the first place because their unemployment rates, economic situation was not as bad as the people in Egypt or Yemen and Tunisia in the first place. So that's number one. Number two is, if you have a non-hereditary regime, what that means is when the president or prime minister is being protested against, the other people in the government or in the military don't have the same skin in the game because that's not their brother, that's not their father. And so they can potentially say, hey, if I throw my lot in with the protesters and get rid of this guy, maybe I'm going to be on the good side of history. I'm still going to be kept in power, and so I'm going to do that. And so guess what happened? In both Tunisia and in Egypt, the military in many ways turned disloyal to the leaders of those countries and helped to remove them. Whereas if you go down the chart to Syria, look, Syria didn't have a lot of oil, still doesn't, but it is a hereditary regime. So when there was an uprising against Bashar al-Assad, guess what happened? The army stayed loyal, most of the politicians stayed loyal, and that's one of the main reasons that Bashar al-Assad is still in power today and the regime has not changed. You can look around at this chart for exceptions as well. Okay, you've got a country like Libya, non-hereditary, so Gaddafi was facing some problems and potential loyalty problems, but a major oil exporter. So maybe he should have been able to buy off his people in some way. Well, one of the reasons Libya might be the exception is, as we'll talk about in just a little bit, that's a country where there was significant foreign intervention by NATO and the United States to help overthrow Gaddafi, without which he still might be in power. The other exception on this chart is Bahrain. If you don't know anything about Bahrain, just basically know this is a small country in the Gulf. It connects to Saudi Arabia by this bridge there, and there was an uprising there, but ultimately the regime stayed in power. Again, why? Because the Saudis in this case did massive military intervention to maintain the monarchy in Bahrain, which is favorable to them, and that's why it stayed in power. So again, this is an interesting exercise you could do with your students to kind of understand the background of the Arab Spring, but also think about some of the things that are happening today. If you want an excellent film to show in your class or to see for yourself, I could not more highly recommend El Maidan, The Square. This was an Oscar-nominated documentary that chronicles the uprising and the protest in Egypt back in 2013, 2014. I show this in my classes. It gives a fascinating look. It shows protesters who are the age of your students or a little bit older in Tahrir Square, going through all the things they do for confronting the police, facing tear gas, all the internal politics of the protesters, of how they agree about getting rid of the government, but they disagree about. Some of them are members of the Muslim Brotherhood, some of them are just kind of secular nationalist youth, and so you really get a sense of the costs of this. It's not just something that's, oh, way over there. You really get put right in the middle of the square when this is happening. So a great documentary to check out. But all of this is a great background to understand stuff that's going on today. So these are just headlines from the past few months looking at protests that are going on in countries like Lebanon, like Iraq, like Iran. So even though the quote unquote Arab Spring, many people would say, has kind of ended, protests in the Middle East has far from ended. In fact, even though there haven't been massive democratic changes in many countries, absent, say, a country like Tunisia, one of the key legacies of the Arab Spring today is the fact that many Middle Eastern publics feel empowered, that protest actually can make a difference to draw attention to their grievances, to get governments to potentially make changes, even if they don't have democratic elections, which again, countries like Iraq does, country like Tunisia does, so more and more countries do. It can still be a lever to potentially push for political change. So whether it's in like Lebanon, where for months there have been extensive protests, or now there's probably going to be even more, unfortunately, as a result of some of the coronavirus, this is something to keep an eye on and to compare to some of the things that have happened before. Okay. So let's move to the second phase, which is going back to the Syrian Civil War. But let's talk about this frame that Dan brought up at the beginning and you guys had a little reading for before, which is a Cold War. Now, when we think about the Middle East Cold War, we can compare it to past Cold Wars that we know, right? Like Soviet Union, United States, etc. But before we do so, let's just give a little background on how countries have intervened in Syria. So what you see here is an array of flags. If you don't know them all, no worries. I'll walk through you real quick. On the right side, these are groups or countries that have basically supported Bashar al-Assad for the most part. So second from the top, we see the Russians, below that, the Iranians, and then this is not a flag of a state, but it's in a flag of an armed group called Hezbollah. Hezbollah in Arabic means party of God. It's the largest political or most effective and powerful political party in Lebanon, also classified as a terrorist organization by the United States and many other governments. Both the Iranians and the Russians and Hezbollah have sent in extensive numbers of troops and support to keep Bashar al-Assad in power because he is an ally of theirs in a variety of ways. On the other hand, the Chinese are also on the side of this chart. They are not a strong supporter of Assad, but they and the Russians have both threatened to veto UN resolutions to intervene against Assad. Now, why is that? Let's go back to Libya for just a moment. Back in 2011, when all these uprisings were happening in Syria, in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in Libya as well, the United Nations actually passed a resolution approving a no-fly zone and airstrikes in Libya because Gaddafi, who was the leader of Libya, this guy pictured here, talked about his people like rats and cockroaches, things that really rang very toughly in people's ears when they think about the Rwandan genocide or other genocides. When you start to dehumanize people, that's often a first step to potentially killing them. And so because there was concern over civilian deaths in Libya, the United Nations passed a resolution under this kind of broader rubric of responsibility to protect, whereby the international community was going to go in and protect the civilians of Libya from Gaddafi. The challenge from the perspective of particularly countries like Russia and China is that they were given, these countries were given an inch, but then they took a mile. So basically, the intervention did not just, quote unquote, protect the civilians of Libya. It also then actively, militarily displaced and killed Gaddafi by supporting a bunch of the rebels inside of Libya. So from Russia's and China's perspective, they passed this kind of responsibility to protect resolution in Libya that was designed to protect the civilians, but then actually turned into kind of like a regime change mission. So when it comes to Syria and the Assad government, which again, the Russians are strong supporters of, they have a naval base in Tartus in northwestern Syria, they sell weapons to Assad, they're never going to support any UN resolution inside of Syria, and so it hasn't happened. So looking back on this chart, you have, again, a number of parties and states supporting Assad. On the left side of the chart, you see Turkey, you see Saudi Arabia, you see Qatar, you see Jordan. At various points, we could have put the United States there. And then in the middle part here, these aren't states. These are flags of groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, the Free Syrian Army, a bunch of Islamist groups. Basically, inside of Syria in various times, there have been hundreds of rebel groups who have been fighting to unseat Assad. The interesting part for us in many ways that we're going to talk about now is why countries are intervening on one side or the other and what they're trying to get out of it, because that's really key to understanding the international relations and dynamics of the Middle East today. So again, this term Cold War, when you guys think about a Cold War, what you probably think about is, okay, a rivalry between different competitive states, but Cold War being cold because they're not actually fighting each other directly. So when we think about the Soviet Union and the United States from the end of World War II up until about 1990, early 1990s, you think of it as a Cold War. Why? Because the Soviets and the United States were competing, but never were US and Soviet soldiers killing each other directly. Instead, they were fighting indirectly in places like Vietnam or in places like Korea or throughout Africa and the Middle East through proxies. And in many ways, when we look at the Middle East today, that's what's happening again. Now, who are the two poles of that Cold War? In many ways, it's Saudi Arabia and Iran. So if you look at this chart, not only are Saudi Arabia and Iran, both centrally located, both quite large countries geographically, even though Iran's got about 3 times the size of Saudi's actual population demographically, they are two states who are fighting or competing for what we would call regional hegemony, which basically means they want to be the most powerful state in their region. They're both decently wealthy countries. They have varyingly strong militaries. Saudi Arabia's got lots of fancy tanks and planes and things that they buy from the US. Iran has less fancy equipment, but a more large and capable and skilled military. And they have great disdain for one another, in part because they both see themselves as the leader of the Islamic world. So Saudi Arabia says, look, we have the 2 holy mosques at Mecca and Medina, the holiest sites in the world for Muslims. We are where the Prophet Muhammad was, born, where Islam was founded. So we're the spiritual leader of the region, but also we carry a lot of political weight, a lot of economic clout because of our oil reserves, etc. So we want to dominate the region. Iran says a lot of similar things. It says, look, we are the leader of Islam, even though we are a Shia country predominantly, which we'll talk about. We're very powerful economically, powerful militarily. We are this 2,500-year-old civilization. We have a true, non-corrupt, Muslim leadership, and so we should be the ones leading the region. And so what you see throughout the region now is you see the Iranians and the Saudis never fighting each other's military or invading the other directly, but you see them fighting through proxies. So you see in Iraq, pro-Iran and pro-Saudi proxies. You see in Yemen, pro-Iran, or at least backed by Iran and backed by Saudi proxies. You see the same thing in Syria, the same thing to varying degrees in parts of North Africa and Libya and elsewhere. And so a lot of what's going on in the Middle East is a Cold War where the Iranians and the Saudis in particular, but also to some extent the Turks, the Egyptians, etc., are all taking part in this kind of proxy conflict. Now, an important thing to understand, especially if you ever followed mainstream media about the Middle East, because again, it's not necessarily, I'll say, the highest quality, though some media sources try better than others to be effective or be intelligent about this stuff. Sometimes what you'll hear is, okay, what's going on in the Middle East is that there's a conflict between Sunni and Shia, and they've hated each other for thousands of years, and that's the way it's going to go. Okay, couple correctives to that. Number one, looking just at this map here, these are countries that are predominantly Sunni, predominantly Shia. You don't know what Sunni and Shia is. Basically, in the 600s, when Islam was founded, for the first few decades, everyone was just a Muslim who followed, Muhammad, etc. In the aftermath of his death, you had a number of people called caliphs, basically, who would take power and lead the Muslim community. After a few caliphs went by, there was a disagreement over who should be the one who leads the Muslim community. Should it be someone from the Prophet Muhammad's bloodline, or should it be someone that many others are seen as kind of like the best person to lead the community? And really, that started to be the difference between those who are Sunni and those who are Shia in terms of who should actually lead the Muslim community. There are also additional practices, there are conflicts and political things that go into it, but in many ways, that's the basic difference. Saudi Arabia is predominantly a Sunni country, Iran is predominantly a Shia country, and the leaders of those countries certainly fit within those religious sects. When we look at this chart or this map, we can see the percent of each country in the Middle East in terms of their Shia percentage. And then the coloring is whether they are a Shiite majority or a Sunni majority in terms of whether they're green or gray. So when you look at this chart, or you think more writ large, the vast majority of Muslims in the world are Sunni. But when you look at the Middle East, particularly the central part of the Middle East here, it's actually close to parity because Iran is majority Shia, Iraq is majority Shia, and then countries like Lebanon are close to majority, and countries like Syria and Eastern Saudi and Kuwait have significant Shia populations. So even though worldwide or around the Middle East and certainly North Africa, Sunnis dominate. In this area here, kind of the central part of the region, there are significant Shia populations. Now, to be clear, Iran and Saudi even though they have sectarian language sometimes by their leaders where they'll denounce the Sunni or they'll denounce the Shia, they will still talk about themselves as the leader of the Muslim world. So it's the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's not the Shia Republic of Iran, right? But their appeals, especially these days when we have civil wars along ethnic and religious lines, more and more ring in the ears of those groups who share their religious sect as well as kind of their broader religion. So in terms of Iran, Iran has growing influence in Iraq, with the Assad government in Syria, because in part Alawis are considered to be Shia by most. Inside of Lebanon, Hezbollah is largely a Shia organization. And then some of these groups in eastern Saudi Arabia that Iran has tried to support for protesting the Saudis or otherwise, also Shia. And so in that sense, it's wrong to say this is just a Sunni-Shia conflict, but it's also correct, unfortunately, to say that amidst this tide of civil war in the region that's been going on for a decade or more now, it has become more and more sectarian, and conflict in many ways reinforces those boundaries. One of the ways I can show this to you, sorry, I'm just skipping ahead a slide or two for a moment, is this. This is a map of Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, at 3 different points in time, from 2003 to 2009. Now, what I want you to look at is the color codings here. You see red, those are predominantly Sunni neighborhoods where it's 80 or 90% plus Sunni. You see green, which are Shia neighborhoods, 80 or 90 plus Shia. And then you see orange, which are kind of mixed neighborhoods. Okay, just look at 2003. First thing you see here is that in this part of Baghdad, the majority of it is actually mixed neighborhoods. So that right there is one of the things that can undercut the kind of broader Sunni Shia, fight forever logic or narrative that people tell, because you're looking in Baghdad, one of the cradles of broader Arab and Muslim civilization, and the majority of people are living in mixed neighborhoods, which means guess what? There's intermarriage, there's friendships, there's people living side by side, not necessarily loving one another all the time, but mixed neighborhoods where people feel safe living that way. And then yet, as you look in 2006 and you look in 2009, what happens? The orange almost entirely disappears, and instead what you see are homogeneous blocks of red and green, whereas before the red and green were more scattered, now it's red on one side, green on the other. Okay, why does that happen? That happens because you have groups like ISIS and also Shia groups like Muqtada al-Sadr's forces who are killing people along ethnic lines. They are Sunnis killing Shia only, or they're Shia killing Sunnis only. And so what's happening is the majority of the people that represent the colors on this map are not themselves necessarily, racist or prejudiced against people from the other religious sect. What they're doing is they're kind of self-sorting into neighborhoods with people from their community because that's how they can be safe. Because they live in mixed neighborhoods, now they're worried that someone from that community is going to kill them, or that they're going to be targeted by one of these jihadi groups who is going to go after them. And so what happened as a result of the Iraq war, one of the unfortunate things that happened is you had the disappearance of a lot of mixed neighborhoods, not just in Baghdad, but around Iraq. And that's what groups like ISIS and to some extent the Iranians and the Saudis kind of want. And ISIS looks at this and they say 2009 is exactly what we want. Because why? Because the Shia are an enemy and the Sunnis, they're at least reconcilable even if they don't all believe in our extreme interpretation of Islam. So that red is like the sea we can swim in, as the gorillas, as Mao would say. Whereas when it's mixed, now we've got a lot of potential enemies in our midst. So unfortunately, you have a number of sectarian actors in the Middle East who are fighting and killing along ethnic lines and trying to move the region from something like this map in 2003 to something like this map in 2009. And so one of the key struggles that's ongoing amidst this kind of Middle East Cold War is also a demographic war over where people are going to live, over whether people are going to be in mixed communities. And there are more refugees in the world now today than there have ever been, a lot of them focused in the Middle East because of the war in Yemen, the war in Syria, the war in Iraq, previous wars in other places in the region. And so this is a huge challenge going forward that, again, you could focus on with your classes to varying degrees. These other maps I skipped over, and again, you can look at them in the slides later. This is just a picture from one of the squares in Tehran, an Iranian protester there, and you can see he's actually knit together a bunch of flags. So the upper left-hand corner there, that's the Iranian flag. The flag below it is Syria. The upper right-hand corner is either the broader Arab flag or actually probably more likely the Palestinian flag. And the bottom right is the Hezbollah flag. So basically trying to show here's kind of Iran's foreign policy today in many ways. The Iranians call it the, quote, axis of resistance. They basically see themselves as the underdog throughout the Middle East. What are they resisting? What they see as U.S. influence of the Saudis, of the Israelis. And so they see themselves as a country as the underdog, but they also see themselves as backing the Palestinian groups like Hamas or Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, the Assad regime, all of these governments or armed groups and political parties that they feel like are fighting for kind of these broader just causes against what they see as unjust leadership. Okay, looking at the Saudi side of the coin, the Saudis, key ally in many ways is the United States. Also, you see Sisi there to the left. That's the president of Egypt, along with President Trump. In many ways, the Saudis care first and foremost about their regime security, right? They've been a monarchy that's been in power for decades. They don't want to be overthrown because of economic reasons, political unrest, etc. But they see Iran as enemy number one, as does President Trump. And so one of the reasons that the relationship with the Saudis has improved, one of the few countries I think it has improved under the current president, is because President Obama, signed the nuclear deal with Iran, which the Saudis did not like. President Trump pulled the US out of that deal. And so in many ways, the Saudi vision of the Middle East, which is Iran is really bad, we can potentially even work with the Israelis, we're trying to potentially, push other foreign influence out of the region, we're pro-US. That's something that resonates with the current US president. And so in some sense, this is not exactly an axis in some sense, but, President Sisi in Egypt, the leader, the king of Saudi Arabia, who recently passed away, and now we have the prince taking over, and President Trump, in many ways have a strengthening alliance, in part because of their shared anti-Iranian feelings. A final key thing to understand about Saudi Arabia is the fact that they have something called the Gulf Cooperation Council. Now, this has been in the news a lot the past couple of days because the Saudis and the Russians in particular have been basically saying they're not going to cut, but in fact, maybe they're even going to increase their production of oil, even as the price of oil is going down now below like $20 a barrel, because they're basically trying to run a bunch of other states and US fracking and others out of business. But what's also fascinating is that the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is depicted here in terms of the countries in orange, historically was something founded in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war to basically prop up all of these monarchies in the region. And what's fascinating is that Jordan, which is not exactly part of the Gulf and maybe borderline is, but also Morocco, which is way over there in West Northern Africa, have both been offered membership of the Gulf Cooperation Council, even though, again, Morocco is in no way part of the Arabian or Persian Gulf. Why is that? It's because the Saudis see monarchy and their type of government as being something they want to defend. They're worried about the wave of democratization that's started to potentially peek its head up in the region. And so they're trying to strengthen and support other monarchies around with the idea that if they're the only monarchy in the bloc, their people are going to look at them and say, this is an outdated form of government. Whereas if pretty much all of the surrounding countries and a bunch of others in the region are monarchies, it's like, hey, this is a normal way of life, a normal form of government. And so the Saudis are very invested in having that happen going forward. Okay, final big country to talk about in terms of intervention in Syria, and then we'll talk about Israelis, the Palestinians, the United States. Let's talk about Turkey a bit. Now, Turkey in many ways is kind of like the swing vote in a lot of this stuff, because Turkey at various points has been very pro-Saudi. Then they've also kind of been pro-Iran in some sense. They're a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So the United States is actually bound by treaty. If the Turks get attacked, that the US would come to their aid and vice versa. Although if you've been following the news, you also see that Turkey has been, if not anti-US, then becoming increasingly authoritarian and also much less supportive of human rights, rights of its journalists, and very anti-US in terms of foreign policy. They bought a very expensive missile defense system from the Russians, et cetera, et cetera. But this picture is worth 1,000 words. This is from a number of years ago on the Turkish-Syrian border. And I want you to look at a couple of things here. First, in the distance there, that city, that's Kobani. That's a city in northern Syria where at the time, those smoke plumes you see rising from there, that was ISIS fighting against the Kurds inside of Syria. What you see in the middle ground there are Turkish tanks just sitting there on the border. Now, to be clear, not one of those tanks is firing a shot. They're just sitting there basically saying, don't come into Turkey, and we're not going to do anything about what's going on over the border there. Why? Because they don't necessarily love ISIS, but they really don't like the Kurdish groups that ISIS was fighting there. So in many ways, Turkey was like, enemy of my semi-enemy is my friend, or at least not my enemy. So I'm just going to try to keep them out of my business and not get involved. And in fact, in the foreground here, you can see some guys just sitting and watching this stuff. It makes me think of like the Battle of Bull Run during the Civil War, where people went out and thought, oh, I'm just going to watch the North and South clash, and this will be fun, and it'll be over soon, and whatever. In many ways, that's what's happened to the Turks. They thought they could stay out of this, but they've been unable to do so. Instead, what's happened, and if you follow the news the past few weeks or months, you've read about this stuff, is that Turkey has actually, over the previous year or two, basically invaded Syria. And in the areas you see here in purple, and it's actually expanded a bit, they have taken control of a lot of the border regions of Syria. Now, why have they done that? Because basically there's 4 million or so refugees from Syria inside of Turkey. So quite a large number. The Turks don't want those refugees to stay there, number one. Number two, there are also Kurdish groups in the northeastern part of the country in the yellow area. And Turkey sees those Kurdish groups as terrorist organizations that now have a sanctuary across their borders to operate. And so Turkey is no longer going to allow, the U.S. or the Syrians or others to try to take care of this issue. They want to take care of themselves. So they basically invaded across the border into Syria to create these quote unquote buffer zones to prevent more refugees from coming over, and then also potentially to forcibly resettle some of the refugees in their own country inside of Syria, while at the same time doing military operations against some of the Kurdish groups there. Now, as the U.S. has pulled back, there's only about 500 U.S. troops in the northeastern part of Syria there. What's happened is that Turkey has increasingly clashed with the Syrian government forces and with Russian forces. And so what you've seen in the past couple of weeks is the fact that we are on the border of an actual international war between Turkey and Syria. Because from the Syrians' perspective, they've been bombing the heck along with the Russians out of Idlib, this city in green there. It's led to one of the greatest humanitarian crises in the war. There's over 1 million people displaced just from that region. And yet, it's really unclear what's going to happen because the Turks have a lot of rebel group allies in that area. They want to control, again, because it's by the border. And so there have been Turkish forces killed. There have been Syrian forces killed in these exchanges. It hasn't yet escalated to international war, but we're on the border of that. And we're not on the border. We're directly in a massive humanitarian crisis there because of all of these actors that are fighting for control, particularly of the border region between Syria and Turkey. So the Turks are doing a couple of things. These are just some headlines I pulled just from the past couple of weeks. There's been a ceasefire that was agreed to about a week and a half ago between Turkey and Russia. They're now doing some joint patrols. But to be honest, if you follow this stuff, these types of ceasefires come and go all the time. So unfortunately, I'm expecting there to be a flare-up of more violence between the Turks and the Russians and the Syrians in the not too distant future. Other things. Turkey, again, is a NATO ally. It's believed that Russia, through bombing or otherwise, killed Turkish soldiers. So if you go to the letter of the law of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization treaty, that means that's an attack on a NATO ally, and the U.S. should come to Turkey's aid. So Secretary Pompeo of the United States has said maybe the United States is going to start to aid Turkey in this. So even though the U.S. keeps saying it's going to pull out of Syria, there's ways in which the U.S. has been pulled back in. The final element that's important to understand is the whole refugee issue. One of the things that Erdogan, who's the leader of Turkey, has said to European states over the past week or two is, yeah, basically, I'm going to open the doors to Europe and allow these millions of refugees to go into Europe because they don't want to stay in Turkey. Europe's, generally going to be better off economically, more welcoming to refugees. So I'm just going to open the floodgates and let them go to Europe. And all of you supposedly non-racist European countries are going to welcome them with open arms, right? Of course, no. A lot of European countries have closed their doors more and more to refugees, particularly amidst coronavirus outbreak. They do not want all these refugees flooding into their country. And Erdogan knows this. So the reason he's doing this is basically to coerce them to either pay him more money. The European countries already pay him billions of dollars to keep some of these refugees inside of Turkey, but also to get them to pressure Russia regarding some of what's going on inside of Syria. So again, if you're interested in this dynamic, one of my co-authors, Kelly Greenhill, is a professor up the road at Tufts. She wrote a great book on what she calls coercive engineered migration. And this is the whole thing that Erdogan is doing and previously Gaddafi did, which is basically using refugees or human demographic flows as political pawns to either get paid off through bribes or to destabilize neighboring countries or otherwise. Even though this is a pretty, I think we would all say morally decrepit thing to do, unfortunately, its prevalence has increased in recent years. And this is exactly what's going on now with the millions of Syrian refugees. They're being used as political pawns between countries to get money, to change political outcomes, etc. So that's something to keep an eye on as well in terms of what's going on in the region. Okay, second to last section. Let's talk a little about the Israelis and the Palestinians. So the Israelis have not had forces deployed on the ground inside of Syria, but they've been nonetheless very involved, in part because their major rivals, their major enemies are Iran, Hezbollah, and guess what? Both of those forces have had extensive involvement inside of Syria. So if you look here on this map, you see the Golan Heights, which is this area in northeastern Israel that the Israelis, claim is theirs, and the U.S. actually recently recognized that it's theirs, and still debated. We could talk about that. But long and short, within a few miles, you have Iranian forces and Hezbollah forces near the border with Israel. And so what Israel has done on a variety of instances is that they have launched bombings inside of Syria, either against Hezbollah or against missile sites, because they're worried about the Iranians transferring more powerful missiles to Hezbollah, which can potentially be used against Israel down the line. So one of the other hotspots in the Syrian Civil War, in case we needed any more to talk about, is the border with Israel here, and the fact that the Israelis are very concerned just about Assad in general, because he backs Hezbollah and is an ally with Iran, which the Israelis don't like, but also the fact that in some of these border regions here, there have been ISIS forces previously, and there have been other forces that the Israelis see as problematic. This is actually a picture I took a couple of years ago when I was in the Golan Heights, just visiting there for research. And what you see in the foreground are United Nations observers. That's the UN flag there. I went and talked with those, the woman and the man there. They're UN soldiers who are there to monitor. They're actually there monitoring the ceasefire between Israel and Syria going back decades. But what they've been pressed into service to do in many ways is to monitor also some of the fighting in the Syrian Civil War. So they're really on the front lines there, kind of monitoring the stuff, seeing if the Israelis or Syrians are violating the ceasefire, reporting that back, etc. But it's certainly a fascinating thing, because if you look on the fields there below, it looks very peaceful. It looks like the beautiful farms or whatever. That's actually Syrian territory, where at various points, not when I was there that day, thankfully, but on other days, you could actually see bombings and fighting of ISIS troops against Syrian forces, and others. So again, this is right on the front lines of where a lot of this stuff has happened. The other way that the Israelis come to the fore with this broader Middle East Cold War is something that's very interesting. There are only two countries in the Middle East that actually two Arab countries in the Middle East that formally recognize Israel and have peace treaties with Israel: Egypt and Jordan. Every other Arab majority country in the region still to this day does not even recognize Israel as existing. They don't have shared embassies and ambassadors. They don't have trade. They don't have travel between them, etc. There is a key way that that's changing a bit. A number of the Gulf countries, most prominently so Saudi Arabia, are not yet recognizing Israel. But if you saw with the recent Trump quote-unquote peace plan regarding the Israelis and Palestinians, Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi leadership said some favorable stuff about it. And that was not a coincidence. The reason being that who's enemy number one for the Saudis? Iran. Who's enemy number one for the Israelis? Iran. Well, guess what? In politics in general, and certainly in the Middle East, again, enemy of my enemy is my friend, or at least potentially someone I can work with. And so behind the scenes, but increasingly not even behind the scenes, the Israelis and the Saudis have had increasing exchanges between them. And in fact, there's some thought that if the Iran nuclear deal went away, if Iran starts to enrich uranium further or develops a clear nuclear weapons program that's on the verge of having a nuclear weapon, the Israelis could potentially launch an airstrike to knock out Iranian nuclear facilities. And in case you think this is too far-fetched, the Israelis have done this twice before. Back in the early 1980s, they knocked out a nuclear reactor in Iraq with a secret nighttime raid through the air, where they knocked out the Iraqi reactor successfully, and Iraq didn't really do anything in response. And then about a decade and a half ago, they knocked out a nuclear reactor in Syria, again, secretively. The Syrians didn't know they were coming, knocked it out. So the Israelis see this and see Iran having a nuclear weapon as an existential threat. They could definitely potentially do something like this. The challenge is, unlike Syria or Iraq, which are a little bit closer, Iran is a little bit of a haul for their planes to get to. So how are they going to get there airspace-wise? As this chart shows, one of the ways they could is largely going through Saudi Arabia, for which they would potentially need permission from the Saudis. The Saudis certainly don't want an Iranian nuclear program either. So this could be one of the ways that they could coordinate. So again, regional politics are shifting a bit. A lot of the Gulf states are potentially talking to the Israelis more, having warmer relations, and a lot of it has to do with this kind of anti-Iran or Iran versus Saudi Cold War that's going on in the region. Other things that come out of this is just a news article from a couple of months ago. First, Israelis are permitted limited visits to Saudi Arabia. So again, there's always been an ability for behind the scenes stuff, but now the Saudis and other Gulf countries are talking about allowing visas or things like that to allow Israelis to come there, which in some ways, again, is a implicit recognition of the state, which has not existed before. Okay, a couple internal things, because again, you guys might have been following this right now. Israel just had an election about a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago. And that was actually its third election in the past year, which is unprecedented in Israel. And I'm not sure, because I don't know about every country in the world, but might be unprecedented worldwide. When we think about presidential elections for the US, we know when the next presidential election is going to be, unless the coronavirus changes it, which I don't think will happen absent some act from Congress. It's going to be in November of this year. The next one's going to be in 2024, then 2028, etc., right? Israel's different. It has a 4-year term for the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and the prime minister, but very rarely does that term actually last 4 years. Because in Israel, they have a parliamentary system where to become prime minister, you need the support of 61 of the 120 members of the parliament. The second that, 3 people break off from your coalition, if you have 61, you don't have 61 anymore, vote of no confidence, the government collapses, and now new elections are scheduled a couple months later. So that's what happens in Israel. What's been happening for the past year or so is that Israel has had elections, and then no group can cobble together at least 61 members of the Knesset to support a single leader. Now, you might say that shouldn't be a problem if they have just Democrats, Republicans. You have an election, someone's going to get at least 61 some of the time. It won't always be 60-60. Well, guess what? Inside of Israel, they have such a low threshold for getting a Knesset seat that Israel has, 6 or 8 significant political parties as opposed to 2 for the United States. So what that means is the biggest Israeli political party only gets about 35 or so seats, which is only about a quarter of the total seats. So they have to cobble together a coalition with at least 3 or 4 other parties to reach that 61 seat threshold. So what's happened at the past 2 elections, 2019, is that multiple parties have tried to get there, cannot get there. What just happened with this recent election is that, again, Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel, got the most seats. His party got the most seats, but they still can't get to a 61 seat threshold. They still have about 58 or so. So this other guy, Benny Gantz, might be able to get to 61, but it's unclear. So Israel is at a state of just domestic disarray currently that's really hamstringing not only its international policies, but also some of its domestic response. Some of the other things that Israel is fighting over internally is this whole idea of whether it's going to be a Jewish state only or it's going to be a state for kind of all of its people. So Israel does not have a constitution. It passed what's called a basic law, which is kind of the closest it comes to like a Bill of Rights in the past year or two, that basically defines Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. It makes Hebrew kind of the only official national language. It, prioritizes Jewish communities inside of the state, et cetera, et cetera. And Benjamin Netanyahu and a number of other Israelis support this move. They're like, yes, this is what we're about. Yes, of course, 20% of our country is an Arab or largely Muslim population, but we are the nation state of the Jewish people. Whereas people like this guy, President Reuven Rivlin, who's shaking Netanyahu's hand there, also a member of Netanyahu's party, says, no, we should be a state with equal rights for all of its citizens, regardless of their religion, ethnicity, etc. So a lot of Israeli internal debates are ongoing over this stuff. In terms of the Palestinians, again, linking it back to the Syrian civil conflict, the Palestinians themselves haven't had elections in over a decade. They have a lot of internal strife and disagreement between, Fatah and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. But the key thing I want to talk about here is the Palestinian refugee situation. This is Damascus in Syria, and you see this circle around Yarmouk. Yarmouk is where there's a massive Palestinian refugee camp, basically Palestinians who are refugees from way back in 1948 or from 1967 who are living inside of Syria. I'm not going to play it for you now, but if you go back through the slides later, you can watch a YouTube clip of some Palestinian refugees returning to this camp after it was the site of extensive bombing and fighting between Bashar al-Assad and a number of jihadi forces. So again, the Syrian Civil War touching all elements and all parts of the region. Okay, last thing I want to talk about, U.S. foreign policy here. So just in terms of the human cost of the Syrian Civil War, it's staggering. There were only about 23 million people in Syria before the Civil War started. And by most count, we've had 500,000 people dead, 6 million refugees, and about 8 million internally displaced persons. So basically, the majority of Syrians from before the war in 2011 are either killed or they've been displaced inside their own country or outside of it. And you can see the number of refugees the U.S. has taken in over time, which has significantly decreased. In terms of what I want to show you, one of the key debates here, and again, I have some slides here you can talk with your class about some of the various options the U.S. can have, from having a humanitarian intervention to staying out to actually actively going in to overthrow the Assad government, is to think about this debate, which is in many ways the central part of the U.S. foreign policy debate. Should the United States be deeply engaged in the world and deeply engaged in the Middle East because that reassures allies, ensures U.S. access to oil, helps for forward counterterrorism? Or should the U.S. have a more restrained foreign policy? Because when the U.S. is involved on the ground, it leads to animosity against the U.S., potential suicide bombings because the U.S. is seen as a foreign occupier. Middle East energy resources aren't as important anymore, especially with fracking, et cetera. So when we look at U.S. politicians, this is kind of them on that sliding scale. And one of the first things you'll see, and it's one of the reasons I think it's great to teach in the classroom, is that it doesn't fit a classic kind of Republican-Democrat spectrum. You have a number of Democrats like Hillary Clinton who are very strong, deep engagers, who want the U.S. very involved in the Middle East and involved in the world, as well as former Senator John McCain, Republican, who also felt very strongly in this way. Then you have someone like President Obama, who was not as deep of an engager as Clinton, but not a full restrainer either. And then someone like Senator Rand Paul, who's a very strong restrainer, wants the U.S. to really pull back from these areas, feels like it's not getting a lot out of it. The reason I have a question mark over President Trump is because he's been a bit mixed on this stuff. Sometimes his rhetoric is, I want the U.S. to be the strongest country in the world. We're going to be militarily tough. We were weak under Obama, et cetera, et cetera. That's talking like a deep engager. But then he's constantly making proclamation about pulling the U.S. out of quagmires in Syria, in Afghanistan, elsewhere. That's much more being a restrainer. But in any case, this is in many ways the broader grand strategy debate that underlies all of the U.S. foreign policy debates you guys are going to see in the upcoming presidential elections or otherwise. Do you think the U.S. is a force for good in the world? And is the U.S. getting a good return on its investment economically in terms of saving lives for humanitarian reasons, et cetera? Or is the U.S. spending a lot of money abroad or hurting its reputation or not really saving and helping things, and so it needs to pull back a bit more? That's in many ways the key debate that's happening in the region and writ large, and you can see this filters into discussions of withdrawal from Syria, the U.S. deal with the Taliban to get out of Afghanistan, etc. The thing I'll leave you with is this. First, I gave you guys a lot of heavy stuff here, so sometimes it's good for a little humor. This is a headline from The Onion. Historians politely remind nation to check what happens in the past before making any big decisions. Sounds good. So the final thing I'll leave you with is this. Again, I'm a social scientist. I like comparisons. Let's look at the past 3 interventions that the U.S. has had in the Middle East, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. And let's look for patterns here. First, regime change, okay? Iraq has had regime change and U.S. boots on the ground, but unfortunately, Iraq has been a disaster in many ways. Libya had regime change, not U.S. boots on the ground, and unfortunately, Libya has been in many ways a disaster for the past decade or so. Syria has not had regime change, has not had U.S. boots on the ground in any significant way, a few thousand, now about 500, and Syria in many ways is a disaster. So wherever you are on kind of the spectrum of U.S. involvement, and I'm someone who's a patriotic American, the U.S. has the strongest military and economy in the world, but looking at this can't help but sober me and maybe humble me and humble you who think about U.S. foreign policy and the U.S. ability to actually have a significant impact in the region. Because regardless of whether the U.S. has been heavily militarily involved, whether there's been regime change or not, a lot of these countries have undergone significant political and economic problems, and the U.S. ability to actually impact them to its liking or to the liking of people in the region has not necessarily been the best. So with that, I will close. This is my contact information. If you're not able to get into questions that you have, that's my email there. That's my Twitter account. That's my website. And if you're interested in broader stuff from me, this is the first book that I wrote that looks at a lot of these factors, a lot of these dynamics, looking at why some nation states get states and others don't, with particular focus on the Zionists and the founding of Israel, the Palestinians, and the Algerians. With that, though, I'll turn it back over to Dan and to your questions.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was an incredible whirlwind tour of the unfolding and evolving political situations throughout the Middle East. I will ask that those of you who have joined, if you could kindly use the hand raising feature to indicate if you have a question. And once you've raised your hand on your control panel, I will individually unmute participants and we can start the Q&A.
And I'll just say that I'm happy to talk through not only anything that I brought up, but any other questions you have about the Middle East in general or about teaching this stuff, I'm happy to discuss.
So while I wait for a hand to be raised or for people to figure out how to use their control panel in the first place, I would like to ask you a little bit about the thesis of rebel power. So thinking about some of the tools that you use as a political scientist, what have you found, or what is your thesis as to why it is that some national movements are able to successfully translate ideology and aspiration into statehood?
Sure. So yeah, obviously this is a key question, whether it's looking at groups like the Kurds or the Palestinians, who to this day are national movements that don't have a real and independent state, versus, again, national groups like the Zionists or the Algerians or others who were successfully able to get states. That's in many ways what I'm looking at in the book. I'm doing a comparison of movements that were successful, which those have been unsuccessful, although to be clear, there's great variation within those. The Algerians, the Zionists, they struggled for many years unsuccessfully before they successfully got their state. So to answer your question, Dan, there's many parts to it, but I'd say the key part has to do with the internal dynamics and fragmentation of a national movement. What I mean by that is, let's just look today at any social movement, right? We could look at the women's rights movement or the civil rights movement or Black Lives Matter or the environmental movement, any movement that's for some broader cause. We all know that in those national or social movements, you have multiple actors. You often have organizations or individuals, etc. They all have kind of this common objective of, changing laws against discrimination against women or having equal pay or whatever else, or environmentally changing regulations on air quality or things like this. But they might differ a bit in exactly what those objectives are, or oftentimes they also differ in terms of how it should be accomplished or who should get the credit for it. So when we look at national movements, that's in many ways the rub. It's something that we call in general, contentious collective action, which is it's collective action because you have multiple parties struggling for the same objective, but it's contentious because, well, oftentimes it involves the use of force, not just protest, but also because the groups within those movements are squabbling with each other for political control. So let's take, for example, the Zionists or the Palestinians. You have multiple armed groups and multiple political parties who are trying to get the British to leave the area so they can establish Israel or they can establish Palestine. But they also want to be the group who is leading Israel or leading Palestine when it's founded. And so the argument that I make is simply this. When you have what I call a hegemonic movement, which is basically a movement that has one dominant actor, could have multiple other actors too, but they're going to be significantly weaker and smaller, that's going to be much more successful and likely to get an independent nation state. Why? Because A, it's going to have a more cohesive strategy that hegemonic or dominant group is going to impose. B, it's going to have less infighting because infighting is just kind of silly to do because if you're one of these weak groups, you have pretty much no prayer of defeating this strong state. And so the resources of the movement are not going to be focused on fighting each other, but instead fighting the common enemy. And then when you have to appeal internationally for support for your movement, you will often be able to do so with a clear and cohesive voice as opposed to multiple voices working across purposes. When you have a fragmented movement with multiple significant groups, now those groups spend a lot of their time sometimes talking against each other, sometimes killing each other. And then when they talk to foreign states, it's like, oh, I want this, but this group wants that. The other side, if they want to negotiate, who they negotiate with? They negotiate with this party. Well, how do we know that party is going to sign on the dotted line with that treaty? So that's a problem. And so at the end of the day, having a hegemonic movement versus a fragmented movement goes a lot of the way of explaining why some national movements get states and others don't. And if you look at the history of the Kurds or the history of the Palestinians, especially today, unfortunately for them, you see a lot of internal fragmentation. And that's one of the major reasons they've been unsuccessful at achieving independence.
Thank you for that. And as you were answering, one of our participants, Natalie, raised her hand. So I've unmuted you, Natalie, if you'd like to pose your question.
I just typed it too. So I'm a grade 6 teacher, and I'm thinking about our new social studies standards and how to begin learning with so many ethnic groups and tough concepts. I know that I definitely need a glossary to begin discussions. But what about resources as far as just starting conversations regarding some of the conflict that's occurring?
Sure. So I have a couple of answers. I'll say for 1 second though, Dan, do you want to say anything about resources that Primary Source offers first, and then I'll say other points I have?
Yeah, to allow for us to focus on your response, I will say that in our follow-up email, if not tonight, tomorrow, I can share some of the sources found on our website. And in particular, I can curate some that are specific to the topic introduced in this webinar tonight. But that's something that I can definitely follow up on in the follow-up email.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you so much for the question, Nadia. I'll give a couple of other suggestions. First, and again, so I think primary source resources are great. Another one that I found that when I was a high school teacher is there's also something called the Choices program at Brown. And they offer a lot of a lot of tech stuff as well that I think is nice because it's not like 500-page books. It's basically like, okay, here's a scenario. Let's take the Iranian nuclear deal, or let's take the civil war in Syria. And I help them develop some of this stuff. And it's basically like, okay, you as a student have like 4 options, right? The United States could go and intervene to try to save lives and do humanitarian intervention. It could go in and try to overthrow the Assad government. It could go in just to fight ISIS, or it could kind of stay out. Here's a little background on each of the players, and here's some of the costs and benefits and kind of pros and cons of each of those. And then the students themselves can kind of learn some of the background of that, have kind of a discussion and debate about what they should do, and in the process kind of learn more about the who's who and what's actually going on, maybe follow the news, etc. So I like kind of simulations or things like that to teach students. I haven't taught as young as 6th grade, but I did teach, 9th graders. And I think that was pretty effective. I think if you, throw a big textbook at them, especially on a foreign area, it can be a little harder to kind of, again, keep all the names and places straight. But when you give them something active like that to talk about, but then to do so, they have to learn some of the parts of it. I think that's great. And I'll also say there are great video resources for this stuff as well. I use a lot of video in my classes, just short, like 2 or 3 minute news clips to show kind of the situation on the ground and make it more kind of palpable and real, along with these kind of backgrounds. So I think that that's good. Other resources I'll point you to. The Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, often does kind of backgrounders or explainers. It's basically this council of academics and former policymakers and government officials who's, they publish the Journal of Foreign Affairs, but online they have tons of free explainers about anything. Like, what's the situation in Syria? Here you go. What's the situation in so-and-so? Here you go. That's a great resource for you. A final one I'll say is the International Crisis Group. They're a great international NGO that has people on the ground in basically every country who is constantly interviewing people and talking to them. So if you ever feel like, oh, all that I'm getting is like very Western filtered news from CNN or New York Times or Fox or whatever, it's like International Crisis Group has these country-based reports. You probably wouldn't give your kids the whole report, but maybe part of it, or at least you would use it as a background, and it will really tell you, like, here's what's going on in that country today, with interviews and quotes from common citizens or others there. It's a great way to get a sense of what's going on the ground. If you have questions about particular countries or units, you're welcome to email me, and I can give you more specific recommendations for my own syllabus or otherwise for particular countries or issues.
Right, thank you.
Welcome.
Peter, I have another question real quickly.
Sure.
So in talking about the new Middle East Cold War, you had mentioned the way in which some of the nation states in the region that are vying for hegemony are funding or using non-state actors as proxies in their ongoing struggles against one another. But I'm curious to know a little bit more about the way in which these non-state actors, Hamas, Hezbollah, and other entities, what sort of power do they exert in this equation? To what extent or in what ways are they using themselves to play these powers against one another? Is there any kind of agency that they have in really trying to influence this dynamic, or are they simply being used as pawns?
Sure. So a lot of my research, since I worked on national movements and I work on terrorism and political violence, is I often go and interview people who are part of these types of organizations. So I have a lot of kind of background on that. And I'll just say to your question, these organizations absolutely should not be stereotyped as pawns or as non-thinking actors without agency. There's varying degrees of the extent to which they have been created versus propped up versus they're kind of using these states themselves. So Hezbollah, in many ways the oldest and the most powerful of the factions I talked about, that was created in large part by Iran because Iran was trying to spread its revolution that happened from 79 to 81. But groups like the Houthis in Yemen that you guys maybe have heard of that have captured significant portions of Yemen are being backed by Iran. They are not a group that was created by the Iranians. They've gotten some support from Iran, but in many ways, Iran has supported them just to kind of stick a thumb in the eye of the Saudis and try to bleed them a little bit close to their territory. Whereas with Hezbollah, they are actively making a play to kind of control Lebanon and be a controlling force. These actors and these groups have their own goals, of course. So Hezbollah cares not just about kind of the broader Iranian revolution or Islamic revolution, however defined. They're, Lebanese individuals who care about the future of Lebanon. They want to have political power in there. They particularly have wanted to serve the Shia community that's concentrated in central and southern Lebanon, that for many decades was neglected by the state that was led largely by Sunnis and Christians. So it's never something that these groups are just there to be pro-Iran or pro-Saudi or whatever. They're just groups who are fighting for political control for their ideological or ethnic community. And then what happens is sometimes foreign powers see what they're doing as being beneficial, so they'll send them arms or they'll send them money. But as the U.S. experience in the Cold War shows, the U.S. had a lot of proxies around the world that either were not very reliable, or sometimes, like in South America, were doing stuff that were, pretty brutal in itself, would maybe qualify as terrorism or brutal acts. So that happens all the time. And so that's one of the reasons that proxies are attractive to the Iranians and the Saudis, because it's like, hey, you can get stuff done that you don't have to put your own blood on the line for, and you have some degree of plausible deniability. But the negative is you get less control because of it, and we've seen that a lot across the region.
One more question. In introducing the concept of a Cold War and a new Cold War in the Middle East, you had harkened back to the geopolitical confluence between the United States and the Soviet Union and what that looked like and how it unfolded. However, it would be helpful if you could also talk about the other Cold War in the Middle East in the mid-20th century, and if you could draw some parallels or distinctions between that Middle Eastern Cold War and the one that we're seeing today.
Sure. So most people haven't heard of it, but yes, there not only was the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, but in the 60s, there was an Arab Cold War. And the two poles for that were Saudi Arabia again, but Egypt instead of Iran. So what's interesting is that even though Egypt and Saudi today are kind of on the same side of it, and again, they're majority Arab, majority Sunni, they both don't like Iran for varying reasons, etc. Back in the 60s, the Arab Cold War was between Egypt and Saudi, and that was on regime type. So in this case, you had Saudi, which then, as now, was a monarchy. But Egypt was a republic led by this guy named Gamal Abdel Nasser, who is in many ways head of the broader Arab nationalist movement. And so the Saudis saw this kind of popular Arab uprising that had led to, in some ways, Nasser's power being a real threat to their own control inside of Saudi. So they fought a number of conflicts, again, another one actually in Yemen, and many other parts of the world inside the region. That was, again, a rivalry where you never had Egyptian troops fighting Saudi troops, but you did have, again, this kind of struggle indirectly through proxies for control of the region. So, in many ways, unfortunately for the people of the Middle East, it's not incorrect to say that their region has faced a significant amount of conflict. And a lot of the reasons for that is because whether it's local states like Saudi Arabia or Iran or Egypt, or foreign states like the Russians/Soviets or the United States or the British and French, they have played out their political power rivalries inside of that region. And unfortunately, the people of the region have often been the ones who have paid the cost of it without necessarily significant benefit. And that still endures today.
So I have gone ahead and unmuted all participants. And, okay. So we were just trying to unmute people to see if there are any lingering questions that are not appearing in the chat box. But if that's the case, if there are no more questions, I just want to thank you one more time for your collaboration in this project, for being our guest scholar to initiate this multi-part series. Again, for those of you who have joined us tonight, please.
There are some hands if you wanted to ask or not. Judy Katz has a hand. There's some there, but I don't know if you want to.
Let's unmute Judy. And Judy, you are now unmuted.
Thank you. Hi, Peter. Thank you. Will your slides be available later?
Yes. So I can't make every single one of them available, but the majority of them I can. I will happily send them to Dan, and then you guys can reference them later. And you're welcome to use them for your own classroom teaching. The only thing I would ask is just don't, publish them online or anything like that, but you're welcome to use them in your own classrooms if you like.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. So with that, I'm going to thank you one last time. Again, in this moment of changing realities brought on by the coronavirus and other unfolding global political situations, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to give us an hour plus of distraction and edification. It's really instrumental in the work that we're doing, and it's really helpful for teachers who are likely at home for the foreseeable future. So again, we're truly honored that you joined us tonight.